sometimes learning and development is too quickly managed as a cost for the organization, or just compliance work in a sense. And really, there are aspects that can be looked at as truly adding value to an organization. In the modern world of business, increasingly jobs are changing because of the addition of IT tools or even AI or natural language processing or other things. Well, this means that what a top performer decides and does today is not the same in many job categories as what it was even 2 years ago.
Welcome to this week's LearnOps Leadership Series. I'm very excited today to host Bror Saxberg, who I've known for several years. Bror has been a part of the Synapse journey from the very beginnings, and I've never actually learned about your story, Bror. Thanks for attending today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for asking.
So, what I do know about your background is that you were formerly the Chief Learning Officer at Kaplan. You've been a Vice President of Learning Science at the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. And recently you launched LearningForge to help organizations across the learning ecosystem achieve their goals, essentially, right? And what I've come to really respect about you is your background in learning measurements and that you're an outcomes-focused leader, which is really important in my opinion. But we would love to know about your story and background. How did you even get into learning and development?
Sure, happy to tell you a story. It is, as many of these stories are, a little winding. I started life as a research guy. I'm an MD, PhD. I used to do human and machine vision research at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory a long time ago, before fire, before the iPhone, as my daughter likes to put it. She's not sure which came first. She just knows it was a long time ago, let's put it that way. And after finishing my research work there, which was about, human and machine vision, I jumped into McKinsey for a few years because I really wanted to learn how do you put together people and ideas and resources and funds and get them to go in the same direction? And the academic research setting didn't really give you any background on that. And so I spent a few years within McKinsey. And then in the mid-90s, I jumped into the middle of what was then known as the multimedia revolution. This was the days of CD-ROM for your younger listeners. Those are those round silver discs that you used to put into computers to actually do stuff. And so from then forward, from the mid-1990s forward, I've been in a series of assignments that have always been at this intersection of learning science, technology, outcomes, learning measurement, sometimes artificial intelligence, professional development, but always at scale. And so I was one of the founders of what is still a fairly large virtual education company called K12.com. And then from there, I went to Kaplan, as you said, and became the chief learning officer there. We had something like 25, 30 different learning organizations all around the planet with very different kinds of learners and different outcomes. Many people in the US know Kaplan for its test prep work, but they also had a lot of business development work, both in the US and overseas, as well as English language learning that was being done. And so a wide range of different kinds of learners. They had a virtual university that was more akin to a kind of a community college-like population, all the way up to CFA training, which is then, really elite students and professionals trying to complete some very hard professional qualifications. And the CEO of Kaplan, who's still there, Andrew Rosen, he just had this insight that they had too many models of how learning works across the organization. They had brought all these businesses together and had let them bring their own models of learning. But when Andy took over as CEO, he wondered, why do we have so many user manuals for human minds? This doesn't make sense. It's the same device, isn't it? Can't we learn from each other's work about how to do this better? And that was the point at which they decided to hire a chief learning officer and ground all of their different organizations on use of learning science. And so I had a small team which then worked with all the larger development teams within the different businesses at Kaplan to help them one, understand how learning science, development science, motivation science could apply to their areas, and then two, to work with them on what were their biggest problems, because each organization had its own main priorities, and so we then worked on that. And so over the 8 or 9 years I was there, really transformed Kaplan a long ways towards being what you could think of as a learning engineering organization, where I make the distinction between learning science and learning engineering, the same way that you make the distinction between chemistry or chemical sciences and chemical engineering, that chemical engineering is absolutely about using the sciences of chemistry, but you have to bring in a lot of other multidisciplinary skills and ideas to make something in the field at scale. And a chemist, just a pure scientist chemist, is not all you need to really make a large, let's say, pharmaceutical factory that actually delivers on its constraints and its economics and safety regs and all the rest. And I think our whole training ecosystem, from all the way down pre-K, all the way up into corporate training, suffers a bit that we don't have that same notion of a profession of learning engineers. There's beginning to be a few programs that are starting to call themselves that and to train people to do that. But it's there are very few people who really have that strong background in learning and development science, and then are working practically to bring those insights out into the real world. And so that's what I've done for many years. My work at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, it was very similar. It was, how do we bring learning sciences, development sciences, and motivation sciences to bear on K through 12 education? And so we worked with researchers, we worked with school districts, we worked with partnerships, innovation partners who were trying to help school districts innovate. And in all those cases, part of what we were trying to do was to get people to pay a lot more attention to what we know about how learning works, how motivation works, and put that to really good work to increase the odds of success for their learning goals. So that's kind of how I got to where I am. So
it's a fascinating story. And at Kaplan, when you started working with the different groups, were they, I would imagine they were all different teams within each group? Did some of the
Yes.
groups, the 25 groups, have multiple teams associated to it?
Yes.
Or was it, okay, interesting.
Yeah, it was almost everything you can imagine, from a business unit having just a single fairly small learning development team that then we would work with, to, for example, Kaplan University. They had many different faculty working on many different degree programs. And so that was, multiple different kinds of domains and disciplines, but also just personalities and ways of working. And same thing really on the corporate training side. There were, the nursing training people were different than the CFA people, who were different from, other kinds of qualifications as well. So it very much mixed grill. But what we tried to do was first give everyone a kind of a common grounding on what the sciences of learning and development and motivation suggest about human minds that often isn't appreciated by folks in L&D, and then worked with each unit and the leaders in each unit, the learning leaders in each unit, to then help them use that information and have their teams, not us, but their teams then begin to change what they were working on, like I said, to try to increase their odds of success. So, for example, a major group in the Kaplan test prep organization became very interested in understanding, how about their test prep questions, the actual measurement items? Did they actually have a wide enough spectrum of difficulty? And so we helped them do the analytics and find people who could help them understand that in more detail. And they were able to realize that they had great items, but not all the way up the difficulty scale. And by changing those difficulties, they were actually able to increase the satisfaction of their users about the nature of the practice items that they were actually having. Whereas at Kaplan University, which was the old name, it's now Purdue Global, I think is what it's called. But when it was Kaplan University, they were very interested in, how do we make sure our students can just be successful through their degree programs, can continue to stay on board and stay motivated? A totally different kind of question. But still grounded in the sciences of learning and development. And so we began helping them run randomized controlled trials to try different techniques to help the faculty understand what was going on with students and who was having more issues and what kinds of tools would help faculty more than other kinds of tools. So really wide array of kind of problems. But our goal was to really help each of the learning units, use learning sciences themselves to solve what were their priorities. And so our goal was to kind of coach them and expose them to the possibilities, and then, just help them do some problem solving as they needed it.
Got it. And to unwind it a little bit, to understand some of the operational complexities when you came in, and sounds like it was a little bit fragmented or federated, or decentralized. However, we wanted to implement some best practices to standardize the learning science and the design blueprint of the curriculum. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's right. The idea was not to centralize the operations, but rather to get people using more common language about learning and learning measurement. And that had several benefits. One was they could actually then catch up to what does learning science say about expertise. And there's a lot of things that we know about human expertise that is not well appreciated in many different educational environments of all different kinds. So getting people on a more common ground about what is known about expertise and how do you achieve expertise, that was one piece. But the other piece was then the ability for the units to start to talk with each other, so that a unit that was very focused on measurement and item quality could then talk to another unit, and that way they could sort of share what they were learning with each other and benefit from each other, because now they had similar language, not necessarily exactly the same, but now they didn't feel like they were siloed and just unable to understand each other. They could actually begin to talk. And that was one of the things we began doing, was having these kind of cross-organization conversations among the learning leaders, so that they could begin to see, oh, wait, you are working on something and you're further along on it, and it's something that I think is needed for my group. Then now we should start collaborating and seeing what we could do. And so there are a number of benefits of trying to get the language and some of the ideas to become common, as opposed to siloed. And honestly, a good analogy is when you think about the healthcare ecosystem, even worldwide, that, it's not a centralized organizational structure, of course. And yet, many different levels of users of healthcare or participants in the healthcare ecosystem, they all do now share a kind of a common story about how human health and biology works. Like this pandemic, it's kind of amazing when you think about it that, at least throughout most of the West, people do buy into this idea that there's something that's invisible and small that is causing disease in people. And we need to do something to our own bodies, these vaccines, to make other small things that can then fight off these other invisible things. If you tried to sell that script in Hollywood, they would tell you this is silly, right? That's just, nobody's going to believe this because you can't see any of it, right? And yet, it is a story that actually lines up with the evidence. Now, the evidence is much deeper and richer and more complex, but there now is this kind of shared story. And even folks who are grumpy about vaccines and things like that, they're actually still using the language of that story to say things like, I'm not sure they've been tested long enough, or I don't know that I believe that efficacy data, and so forth. They're not agitating for a brand new mythology of health. They're actually sort of staying within the guardrails of this story. And that has been so helpful to allow progress along many different sectors within healthcare. And, learning, and you look at the chaos that's happened to learning with the pandemic, part of the challenge is there isn't this sort of shared language around learning that has a deep tie to the sciences of learning and motivation and development. Mm-hmm. So you have lots of people making up stories about what works for learning and trying their best. People are trying their best, but not having an evidence grounding to actually kind of create guardrails for how they want to innovate and how they do things. And so that was the idea at Kaplan, in part, was to try to create common language to see how we can make that work.
Understood. And so what type of practices did you put in place to be able to have the autonomy of not being a centralized organization, so being somewhat decentralized, but being able to share best practices? What frameworks did you put in place? How did you get that to work operationally, out of curiosity?
Well, some of it was around creating a kind of a high level framework for how to think about learning and even the change, how to think about business change tied to learning. But on learning development, for learning and development professionals, a lot of this is fairly standard, but it's still amazing how often things are not actually done in the right order. So things like really paying attention to the learning outcomes to begin with, and being really clear about what do you want people to decide and do, and to frame it that way. And instead of, many people will end up with and recognize learning outcome statements that talk about knowing. A learner will know X, Y, or Z, or know how to X, Y, Z. And that's not a great phrase, because it's hard to be able to say, well, how would I tell if you know this? Whereas if you can drill down to say, what are you going to be able to decide and do? That actually makes it much easier to start generating evidence about, well, are you able to decide and do this? Because the very statement of what you want somebody to be able to decide and do almost begs for an appropriate evaluation or assessment or a project or something against it. And so thinking really clearly about learning outcomes is very important. I'd also add to that, this is one of the pieces that comes out of learning sciences, which is experts, top experts, they often no longer have verbal access to all the patterns and even decisions that their brains actually make. Having done it for 10 years or 20 years, a lot of things are just, well, obvious to them. I mean, just, of course I'm going to go left here, right? And it can be surprising then that they are not necessarily on their own the best people to tell you what should learning outcomes be, because they don't actually fully know unless you really work with them and watch them and interrogate them as they do their work. They may not be able to just spin off exactly what it is that their minds are doing. This actually came up in the 1960s when people were trying to do the first artificial intelligence efforts, and they thought it would be really easy. Sit down an infectious disease expert and just have them say what they do. And then we'll just put it in a computer, and now we have infectious disease experts that are available to everybody. How hard can this be was kind of the question. And as they began to try, they began to discover, wow, what the experts say is not sufficient, one, and two, it sometimes doesn't even match what they do. Mm-hmm. When you actually then have them go to work, as opposed to have them say what they think they are doing when they go to work. And so this created a whole line of research into expertise that led to people recognizing, wow, as much as 60 or 70% of what a top performer decides and does is actually non-conscious. And so you really do need to interview several, not hundreds, but 5, 10, something, top performers to then figure out what are these minds actually deciding and doing. And then that lets you start to figure out your measurement and evaluation, and then, of course, your instructional practices as well. Another piece of this that's interesting is how often learning and development professionals, and we found this when we were working with corporations, it wasn't that common that people really deeply looked at the value of decisions that they were trying to get people to make. And one of the things that we tried to advocate for a lot when we were talking to corporations was to say, look, find in your pool of workers, especially large organizations, who are high volume, high value, high variance decision makers. So, you have a lot of nurses in a big healthcare system. So that's the high volume. They also are high value. That is, the decisions by nurses have an awful lot to do with how care turns out, whether it is how long patients stay, whether they come back because they didn't understand the instructions for medications, because that's the nurses that often give that, issues of satisfaction with the service, legal issues, all kinds of stuff. Wow, yeah, nurses are right at the center of that value delivery. And then they are actually high variance. That if you actually look at what is valuable for a healthcare organization in terms of nursing decisions, how much time people stay in the hospital, do they come back, other costs and injuries and things like that, you discover there's wide variance in how much value nurses add. And so if you can identify out of 1,000 nurses in a healthcare network or organization, who are the 5 or 10 who add the most value to their organization, studying what they decide and do, you discover they're doing some things often very differently than the median performer. And so that requires an investment. Yes, you really have to dig in there and spend time with them and so forth. But often the value of that in terms of improved decision making that affects, honestly, the bottom line of the organization can really be substantial. And I think, sometimes learning and development is too quickly managed as a cost for the organization, or just compliance work in a sense. And really, there are aspects that can be looked at as truly adding value to an organization, and measuring that makes a lot of difference. In the modern world of business, increasingly jobs are changing because of the addition of IT tools or even AI or natural language processing or other things. Well, this means that what a top performer decides and does today is not the same in many job categories as what it was even 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And if you try to just hire a new person in with the new skills, it takes them a year or two to learn the culture, learn the customer sets, understand the business. And pretty soon, it is inefficient to be trying to fire and hire your way to new skills compared to just getting good at the learning and development function of really identifying what are those new skills, how do we get our existing people who hold the culture, who hold the history, who have the relationships, how do we move them to top performing kinds of decisions and tasks? Mm-hmm. And so I actually think the L&D function over the long haul here is going to have a chance to be increasingly valuable, literally to the shareholder value of large organizations or any organization, precisely because of that.
Yeah, and I believe that. And you saw it during the pandemic. Corporations of all sizes turned to the learning and development teams to help them learn a new way of working, learn how to be safe when there was a high degree of uncertainty. They were the superheroes of the organization, and that hasn't stopped now because of the digital transformation as well. You've touched upon.
I'd add one more. I'd add one more thing to that, though, which is it also raises the importance not just of doing training well, but actually looking at the training itself. That is, are you implementing the way you intended? Mm-hmm. And is it getting you the changed decisions that you intended it to get? And creating that kind of a feedback loop, as opposed to just, stand and deliver and then just, move on to the next thing. Getting a real feedback loop and acknowledging the need for continuous improvement is really important, I think, for learning and development professionals for the long haul.
I totally agree. So we touched upon a couple things, K-12 learning, higher ed, corporate. Something that strikes me as being more unique with corporate, which adds a different layer of complexity almost, is that, with learning, you want to be outcomes driven and focus on the learning outcomes. But with corporate learning, a lot of the times you also have to tie the learning outcomes to a corporate objective, right? And it's finding the right strike and balance about, learner being learner-centric and business-centric, right? You have to kind of marry the two together, just given the commercial nature of business. So when looking at corporate learning specifically, what are some of the biggest operational challenges within L&D to marry learning outcomes and business objectives, and doing that more at scale, from an operational context? Any comments or feedback there?
Yeah, well, I think one of the challenges, and this is actually true not just for learning and development, but even for I don't know, large scale systems work and development and business automation and things like that, that the people who are the most skilled, as I said, they don't even realize how skilled they are. And so they can become impatient if they are being asked, you got to help us understand what it is you decide and do. And so they may want to brush you off and on the sense of, listen, I'm a busy guy or gal. I'm adding value to this organization, so don't bug me on this learning and development task or business automation task or whatever. And in some ways, I think learning and development folks need to build up some way of explaining why it's so valuable and important to talk in detail with the business professionals to unpack those learning outcomes that lead to delivery against corporate objectives. And just as I described before, that you can't make it up. And often those top performers, they do some things that are not what are just in textbooks. If you just simply buy off the shelf a selling manual and say, well, I guess that's going to become our sales training, it may not actually give your new salespeople the boost to what the top salespeople have actually learned how to decide and do things. And so I think that's one of the key things, is to really become good at engaging with and getting the business side engaged with learning and development, so that people can start to see that connection, as opposed to it just remaining standardized and almost outsourced to textbook companies, things like that. And then, as I said before, I think that issue of really looking for, well, what are the drivers of business success? Because sometimes a corporate objective may look fairly high level, and that's where you want the business owners and the business practitioners, along with the learning and development folks, to unpack how do we have people decide and do things that lead to this important corporate objective that's kind of a high level. And that's where finding examples of people who really are delivering is really helpful in that way. Because it may be hard for a committee to sort of declare what the details are. But if you find a few people you'd love to clone, if you will, those can be then your guideposts for, okay, what should this training really enable people to become?
Yeah, that makes sense too. We often see now a role called the learning consultant. And I've said this in a previous series. They're almost like what a product manager would be on a product development or software development life cycle, and their job is to understand the needs of the customer, and come up with recommended solutions around that to solve the problem, right? And I think in another series, I also talked about how learning and development should really master almost the skill of storytelling, because the job is just so hard, right? So if you approach a subject matter expert, for example, and say, hey, we need your help on this, versus, hey, the business is having this problem, we actually have come to the conclusion that we could overcome this with this solution. And because you're the expert, you could really help the company right now and so many people by getting involved. Can we count on you, right? So positioning it in a way that also, everybody wants to help people for the most part. So positioning it in a way, what's in it for them? How can they make an impact? Allowing them to see the impact that they can have back on people in the business early on. Not just, we're asking for your time, we know you're busy, here's something else to add to your plate. It's pretty magical when you just twist things a little bit like that too.
And I think that recognition that you are the best at what you do.
Yeah.
And so we want to acknowledge that and, make time for this. Maybe it becomes a bonus piece, ways, as you said, to really make it be something that adds value to that person, that expert, so that they feel like, okay, I will split off a few hours a week for a bunch of weeks to really dig in on this because I feel like I will have a return from that, whether it's recognition or whether it is something else that is valuable to that person. That's actually powerful. And as you said, many people want to help too, but as people get busy and they have their own reward structures, you really want to line up all the influences to help them see that there's no contradiction between helping the whole organization get better at these things and themselves and their own goals and aspirations. So
absolutely. Well, you and I talked a little bit around impact, right? And how sometimes learning and development gets looked at a cost center versus, really seeing the other value that can come from it, from return of investment, impact on learning investment. From your experience in, seeing the industry and being in so many senior learning executive roles, why do you think the industry is looked sometimes as a cost center? What is learning and development doing wrong that maybe they should flip so that the function actually gets the recognition it deserves?
That's a hard question. I think some of it is related to the fact that we haven't, even as a broad society, really understood how learning works and how expertise is developed. So in many parts of the world, there's this myth about talent, the sense that, well, you either are a talented salesperson or you're not. You're either a talented project manager or you're not. And that downgrades, in a sense, the value of learning and development and almost suggests, well, we just need to hire the best people. That's what we should be doing. So, and in fact, what the research shows very clearly is it is not about how are you able to perform today. It really is, are you in a learning and development environment that is well constructed to give you practice and feedback against high value outcomes? And that doing that intensively for a while is what changes your skills and makes you into an expert and highly valuable person. That there's not an easy way to jump over the practice and feedback that's required. But because we have this myth that for some it's just easy, it makes it suggest, well, maybe we don't have to invest that much in learning and development. Whereas if we could get everyone, including managers, financial people, CFOs, CEOs, to recognize that there's a real opportunity here to change people's skills dramatically to being more valuable through the right kind of practice and feedback, that then makes it easier to talk about learning and development as an investment. I also think, as I said, experts themselves, they will often think, well, this isn't that hard. I don't know why we're spending all this time. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? And this then gets communicated upwards into the management chain where it's like, well, this isn't that hard. I mean, what's wrong with these people? How come they can't just do it? Let's keep the costs down here, people. And people think it must be standard. That is, the learning outcomes, they must already be documented. They must already be known. It must be, so let's just get a standard set of training, buy it off the shelf. It's a commodity, right? It's a commodity. And in fact, it is not. Expertise is very contextual. These kinds of complicated decisions and tasks, especially in high value kinds of roles, there's a lot of contextual clues. There's a lot of communication skills. There's a lot of things that, the best people are actually doing right. And we tend to think that's not the case, that it shouldn't be that hard. So I think there's kind of a cultural challenge. And then I think just that very issue of really valuing the decisions and doing the work to understand the difference between median performers and top performers. There may be a little ambivalence on the part of a lot of learning and development professionals, because knowing that it's been a bit of a random walk sometimes, what the training is, they may be nervous about actually documenting the variance among people who are employees. And yet that just seems critical to me to be able to chart a course forward. Requires some courage, but there are tools to then say, we know how to do this better. Let's begin that journey.
And operationally, from your experience, what are some methods to track, and gather data to be able to articulate the storytelling, articulate the return of investment from initiatives that were worked on, and the impact as well?
I think it's interesting. I think some of it is about, and this is true for any kind of major change in an organization, some of it is about first making people aware of what's possible. Mm-hmm. And so that may be examples from outside your own organization, but still in the industry you're in, showing that a better approach to training, a change in how people decide and do things really did add value there. And then finding champions inside your own organization who hears those stories and raises their hand to say, okay, I'm up for trying to do that. I'd like to get to that level too. And then working with them on the existing data that already is around inside the organization to do that documentation I talked about of what is the value of the decisions, and then mapping out who are the most valuable, what's the median look like, and then beginning with those champions, because you need the champions to be able to say, all right, I'm willing to do a pilot, I'm willing to take a run at this, and then begin to turn them into heroes. As things begin to progress, make sure their colleagues begin to hear about the value being added within this unit, within this area. And that unit could be a geographic unit, it could be a business unit of one kind, lots of ways to carve it out. And that then, this is regular change management work, that can then begin to bring more people who say, okay, that's pretty cool what's going on in my neighbor's yard now, as opposed to somewhere far away. This is my neighbor's yard. I want to try this too. And then you can begin to press it forward. Then the last part of this journey, and this is what it felt like at Kaplan, it definitely was a journey, is then to engage with the most senior managers, the general managers and the CEOs. Once you have some examples, both of champions and progress, and have them begin to say, we want more of this value. And then they're the ones who can begin to make this become the way we do things around here. One of the key things that happened at Kaplan was, after a few years of doing examples and having champions and all this, it was the CFO who said, if we really want to make our organization into a learning engineering organization, let's have standalone twice-a-year meetings between each general manager and myself, the CFO, our global CEO, and talk only about learning. What are our learning challenges? What are our learning measures? What are our investments in learning? How is it actually working? And that way, we really will make a focus on this and pay the right amount of attention to what's happening on the learning side, given its importance and how valuable it is to the value of our business. And I think getting to a stage where you can actually engage the senior managers in recognizing this is value adding. This really is value adding, and having them begin to engage with the other general managers in this, that's a great way to kind of finally get on the course of being able to have learning and development professionals really add the value that they can.
Absolutely. So one last question for those people who are starting to execute on this journey to, getting learning and development seen more like a business function or a business on its own that adds that substantial value. For those leaders who have to navigate change to teach their organization the value of learning and development and how it could actually impact bottom line performance, how do they even break down the wall, in your opinion? How should they approach those senior managers to just break down the wall and start building that awareness? Any tips on how they can even just approach those people about this?
Well, some of it is about, as always with this, who are early adopters? Who are folks who seem like innovators already, right? Mm-hmm. Because the the big granite blocks are not the first ones to practice rock climbing on, right? You really want to start with some smaller hills, right? But then the second thing is, as I said, bring in some case studies or examples of learning performance changes to show, hey, this can be done differently. And there are, if you look up articles and papers about things like cognitive task analysis, that's an area, one of the key proponents of that is a researcher named Richard Clark. And he's written a number of great papers about changing practices in healthcare and elsewhere that really altered the value of what practitioners were able to do using some of these evidence-based techniques. There's also a great handbook called E-Learning and the Science of Instruction by Richard Mayer and Ruth Clark. And it's in its fourth edition now. It's a great compendium of learning science, but synthesized into a guide for instructional design with lots of examples of how in corporate training you can make a difference to learning by paying attention to what we know from the science of learning. And so examples from there can be part of this. And then potentially, making some changes within your span of control today so that you can actually then bring examples to those next layer of managers to say, well, we made this change and we gathered the evidence on it. Look, this is now different. We have higher engagement or we have better performance or whatever it is. We want to do more of this. There's nothing like having some real data that's valuable to your organization to get your organization to actually pay attention. And that's part of where champions are valuable, that they then assist as business leaders, even if they're local business leaders, they then assist in making cases that you all together can begin to bring up the chain to get more awareness of this. And then everybody wins, right? The business leader wins because their smartness in trying to do things better is recognized and acknowledged. And the learning and development leader wins because these new techniques that they're bringing in from learning sciences and motivational sciences, they are changing what learners are experiencing and how they think about their own learning. So those are the kinds of things that I would try to do.
Yeah,
and so starting small, getting good measures so that you really can tell the difference. Those are things that I think are really helpful.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated your comment about not trying to start at the top, find your champions in the organization, gather the case studies that show the transformation from, historical projects that you might have worked on or invested into, and then build up, because you can go quick that way. And I totally agree with that strategy as well. I think it's excellent advice. There's also somebody, I'm not sure, Bror, if you've heard of him, Paul Leone, who has written some books on learning measurement and has a framework about it. It's a practical approach. We're actually doing a webinar with him soon at Synapse, which is exciting. But there's a lot of good practical tips on how to do it from his side too. Bror, this conversation was really enlightening. Really excited to connect with you again, and just wishing you the best 2022 with lots of successes. Your new company is really important mission to help all these learning organizations reach excellence and their outcomes, and wishing you all the success with that too.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and really glad to continue to work with you and your team as you're trying to make it easier for L&D professionals to be efficient and systematic in how they build out better training for their organization. So it's been a pleasure to work with you for all this time, and I look forward to more as we keep going.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your support as well. Thanks for watching the LearnOps Leadership Series. For more episodes like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And visit us at Cognota.com. That's Cognota.com.